Fact 1. The most counterintuitive fact about Adolf Hitler begins in 1939, when a Swedish parliamentarian nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. This was an act of sharp irony aimed at shaming Hitler and the politics of appeasement. E.G.C. Brandt withdrew the nomination soon after, stating he intended to nail to the wall of shame as enemy number one of peace. At that moment from the outside, Hitler appeared as a statesman who had achieved territorial gains without immediate military conflict. The world was watching a leader who had just been Time magazine's Man of the Year, and the nomination reflected a widespread, desperate hope that major war could still be averted. This single fact immediately shatters the simple caricature, forcing us to confront the complex reality that historical figures are never one-dimensional. The perception of Hitler in 1939 was vastly different from the monster we recognize today. To understand how this transformation occurred, we need to go back to the beginning, to the formative years that created the man who would later be nominated for a Peace Prize. Fact 2. Long before the Nuremberg rallies, Adolf Hitler was a young man with a very different ambition: to become a painter. His rejection from the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, not once, but twice, was a profound personal failure that shaped his worldview. Drifting through Vienna, he encountered the intense ethnic prejudices and radical politics that would later form the core of his ideology. These early years were marked by poverty and resentment, a far cry from the image of the infallible leader he would later cultivate. His service in the First World War was another critical formative experience. Contrary to the myth of the brave frontline soldier, Hitler was a dispatch runner, a dangerous but not frontline combat mole. He was injured, gassed, and decorated for bravery, yet the war's end left him, like many Germans, feeling betrayed by the political establishment. This sense of betrayal, the infamous stab-in-the-back myth, became the emotional fuel for his political rise. These early failures, the artistic rejection, and the national humiliation forged an obsession with strength, willpower, and a burning desire for vengeance that would define his entire political career. Fact 3. Hitler's ascent to power was not an accident. It was a masterclass in calculated image crafting. He understood that to move from a street corner orator to a national leader, he needed a complete personal rebranding. The first step was building a myth around his own past. His WWI service was exaggerated into a narrative of heroic frontline sacrifice. The Nazi propaganda machine tirelessly promoted the image of the humble corporal who survived the trenches, making him relatable to the common German soldier. This was paired with the powerful stab-in-the-back narrative, positioning Hitler as the one leader who understood the betrayal and could restore national pride. His physical presentation was equally deliberate. The frantic, screaming orator of early beer hall speeches was gradually replaced by a more measured, statesman-like figure. His wardrobe changed, his speaking style became more controlled, and public appearances were meticulously staged to project an image of authority and calm determination. This was a conscious effort to appeal to the middle and upper classes who might have been alienated by his earlier radicalism. Behind this carefully constructed facade, however, was a man grappling with significant hidden health issues. He suffered from a range of ailments, including chronic stomach problems and severe sleep disorders. These were concealed from the public, as any sign of physical weakness would have undermined the image of the superhuman, tireless leader. His personal physician became a crucial figure, administering complex drug cocktails to maintain the leader's public energy. This gap between the robust public image and the privately frail individual reveals the fundamental artifice at the heart of his rise. The persona was a product, designed for mass consumption and political gain. Fact 4. The public image of Hitler was one of disciplined, almost monastic dedication, but his private life was a web of contradictions that often defied his own public rhetoric. Perhaps the most well-known of these was his strict vegetarianism. Publicly, he presented it as purity and compassion. Privately, it mixed digestive troubles, image-making, and a performative concern for animal welfare, even while orchestrating unprecedented human suffering. This created a stark moral dissonance. He could express genuine distress over the slaughter of a lamb while simultaneously signing orders for mass exterminations. This wasn't just a personal preference. It was part of a carefully managed image of purity and self-control, an attempt to distance himself from the perceived decadence of his political enemies. His relationships with women followed a similar pattern of contradiction. They were often intense, possessive, and ultimately tragic. His relationship with his niece, Geli Raubal, was marked by extreme control and ended with her suicide, an event that profoundly affected him. Later, his long-term relationship with Eva Braun was kept entirely secret from the German public. She was hidden away at the Berghof, her existence unknown, because the image of the celibate leader wholly dedicated to the nation was a more powerful propaganda tool. The private man sought companionship and normalcy, but the public figure could not afford to be seen as having such ordinary human attachments. His daily routines were rigid and eccentric. He was a chronic insomniac, often holding late-night monologues that exhausted his inner circle. His days were structured around lengthy, meandering meals that functioned as informal cabinet meetings, where policy decisions were made amidst rambling speeches. He had numerous superstitions, including a reliance on astrology and fortune tellers at various points, particularly as the war turned against him. His artistic tastes were also revealing. While publicly championing classical German art, he privately had a great fondness for Hollywood films and operettas, which he would watch in private screenings. This again highlights the gap between the public champion of high culture and the private individual with more conventional entertainments. Perhaps most critical to understanding his decision-making was his deteriorating health and increasing dependence on drugs. Under the care of his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, Hitler was subjected to a reckless regimen of injections. These included stimulants to get him through public appearances, sedatives to combat his insomnia, and various concoctions for his chronic digestive issues. As the war progressed, this pharmaceutical dependency worsened, likely affecting his judgment, contributing to his tremors, and exacerbating his paranoia. The leader who presented himself as the embodiment of iron will was, in private, a physically and mentally deteriorating man, being propped up by experimental medicine. These personal habits weren't separate from his political life. They directly influenced his mood, his energy levels, and ultimately, the strategic decisions that shaped the war. Fact 5. While Hitler's public rhetoric was filled with fiery ideology and racial dogma, his actual political and economic strategy was often pragmatic and surprisingly calculating. This is one of the most overlooked aspects of his rule. For instance, upon taking power, the Nazi regime inherited an economy devastated by the Great Depression. The public solution was rearmament and nationalistic projects like the Autobahns, but behind the scenes, the economic policy was far more complex and often contradicted socialist elements of the party's platform. Hjalmar Schacht, the president of the Reichsbank, implemented a system of MIFO bills, essentially a form of shadow financing, to fund rearmament without causing immediate inflation. This was not the work of ideological purists, but of economic realists who understood the need for stability alongside militarization. This pragmatism extended to foreign policy, most notably in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. This non-aggression treaty with the Soviet Union was a stunning reversal, an alliance with the very Bolshevik ideology that Nazism was founded to destroy. For Hitler, it was a purely strategic move to avoid a two-front war while he dealt with France and Britain. It demonstrated that ideological purity could be instantly discarded when strategic advantage was at stake. The pact included secret protocols to divide Eastern Europe, showing that realpolitik, not just racial theory, drove his early diplomatic maneuvers. Another layer of his decision-making involved interests that fell outside conventional politics altogether. Hitler, and several key figures in his inner circle like Himmler and Hess, had a well-documented fascination with the occult and pseudoscience. The Ahnenerbe, a research institute founded by the SS, was dedicated to proving Nazi racial theories through archaeological and anthropological expeditions, searching for mythical origins of the Aryan race. While the direct impact of these beliefs on military strategy is debated, they certainly influence the symbolic and ideological framework of the regime. The search for relics like the Holy Grail or the Spear of Destiny was taken seriously by high-ranking officials, indicating a worldview where myth and reality were dangerously intertwined. This blend of cold, calculated strategy and mystical belief created a unique and volatile approach to governance, where logistical plans could coexist with quests for ancient power. This calculated approach reached its peak in the lead-up to war. Each aggressive move, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, the demands on Czechoslovakia, was carefully gauged to test the resolve of Britain and France. Hitler was a gambler, but he was gambling based on intelligence and a reading of his opponent's reluctance to fight. He understood their trauma from the First World War and exploited their desire for peace at any cost. This period reveals a leader who was not a simple madman, driven solely by hate, but a shrewd tactician who skillfully manipulated the international order until his calculations finally led to a war he believed he could win. The transition from these political calculations to full-scale military ambition was not inevitable, but the result of a series of successful gambles that emboldened him to take ever greater risks. Fact 6. The popular image of Hitler's military leadership often focuses on the early, stunning successes of Blitzkrieg. But this narrative overlooks a consistent pattern of strategic blunders that began long before the tide turned at Stalingrad. His personal interference in military operations, often against the advice of his professional generals, was a critical weakness. The first major misjudgment came even before the war, with the decision to halt the German panzer advance during the Battle of Dunkirk. This halt order remains one of the most debated decisions of the war. Whether driven by Hitler, von Rundstedt, or caution over terrain and logistics, the 3-day halt let the British escape, an error that prolonged the war. His generals had urged allowing the tanks to press forward and destroy the trapped British expeditionary force. This allowed the miraculous evacuation from Dunkirk to occur, saving the core of the British Army and ensuring that the war would continue. This pattern of overriding expert advice continued throughout the conflict. His fixation on symbolic objectives over strategic ones repeatedly cost the German army. The most famous example is the Battle of Stalingrad. Military logic dictated bypassing the city or encircling it to force a surrender. Instead, Hitler became obsessed with capturing the city that bore Stalin's name, turning the battle into a brutal war of attrition in urban terrain that nullified the German advantage in mobile warfare. He refused to allow the Sixth Army to break out of the encirclement, condemning hundreds of thousands of men to death or capture. This was not an isolated error, but part of a deeper flaw, a growing distrust of his military command and a belief in his own infallible intuition. His intelligence failures were equally catastrophic and often willful. He consistently dismissed or underestimated intelligence that contradicted his preconceived notions. German intelligence on the Soviet Union was profoundly flawed, but even when accurate reports filtered through about the sheer scale of Soviet industrial capacity and troop reserves, Hitler dismissed them as exaggerations. He believed the Soviet state would collapse like a rotten door with one hard kick. This miscalculation of enemy resilience was a fundamental error that doomed Operation Barbarossa from the start. Similarly, he ignored clear warnings about the United States' industrial potential, believing the country to be weak and decadent. Technologically, Hitler's initial skepticism delayed crucial innovations. He was famously unimpressed with early demonstrations of jet aircraft and rocketry, seeing them as curiosities rather than war-winning weapons. His conservative view of warfare, shaped by his experiences in the First World War, made him slow to grasp the revolutionary potential of new technologies. It was only later in the war, when Germany was on the defensive, that these projects received significant resources. By then, it was too late to affect the outcome. The cumulative impact of these errors, the tactical blunders, The intelligence failures, the technological delays, created a cascade of setbacks. Each mistake compounded the last, stretching German resources to the breaking point and revealing that the supreme military commander was, in reality, a gambler whose luck had finally run out. Fact 7. When we picture the Nazi war machine, we imagine a monolithic entity driven purely by ideology. The reality was far more complex and filled with surprising contradictions. The weapons that defined the German military effort often had unexpected origins that contradicted Nazi racial theories. The V-2 rocket, a terrifying technological leap, was largely the product of Wernher von Braun and a team of scientists who, in their single-minded pursuit of engineering, were relatively apolitical. Their work was co-opted by the regime, but the driving force was scientific ambition, not Nazi ideology. Similarly, some of the most effective German tank designs were heavily influenced by earlier collaborations with the Soviet Union and incorporated ideas from American automotive manufacturing. The war machine was a patchwork of innovation, pragmatism, and stolen technology, not a pure product of National Socialist theory. The logistical challenges of fighting a war on multiple fronts forced innovations that were born from sheer necessity. The German army started the war with a surprising reliance on horses for transport, a fact often overlooked in the image of a mechanized force. As the war progressed and fuel shortages bit hard, the military had to become incredibly resourceful. They developed ingenious field repairs for tanks and aircraft, often cannibalizing damaged vehicles to keep others running. The ersatz or substitute economy became a hallmark of the late war effort, producing synthetic rubber, fuel, and other critical materials from coal. This logistical ingenuity was a response to failure, not a sign of strength, a desperate attempt to keep a struggling war effort alive. One of the most startling aspects of the Wehrmacht was the significant number of foreign volunteers who fought alongside Germans. Hundreds of thousands of men from across Europe, including large contingents from the Baltics, Netherlands, Belgium, France, and Scandinavia, joined Waffen-SS divisions. Their motivations were incredibly varied. Some were ardent anti-communists, others were opportunists seeking adventure or reward, and some were ideologically aligned with fascism. This reality complicates the simple narrative of a national war, revealing it as a European civil war with deeply tangled loyalties. The German war effort was not just a national project, it was an international coalition of convenience, built on a volatile mix of coercion, ideology, and pragmatism. The economic warfare tactics employed are also rarely discussed. Beyond the blatant plunder of occupied territories, the Nazis engaged in sophisticated financial warfare. They flooded Allied countries with counterfeit currency in Operation Bernhard, a massive counterfeiting program that produced over £100 million in forged notes to destabilize the British economy. They also engaged in complex black market operations to acquire strategic materials like tungsten and rubber from neutral countries. This economic front was as critical as the military one, a shadow war fought by bankers and forgers. But behind every innovation, every tank produced, and every rocket launched was an immense human cost. The German war economy was utterly dependent on forced labor, with millions of prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates worked to death in factories and mines. The surprising efficiency of the war machine was built on a foundation of unimaginable suffering, a fact that remains the ultimate truth of the Nazi regime. The transition from the machinery of war to the human resistance against it is a critical shift in perspective. For all its power and complexity, the Nazi state was never as secure as it appeared. The concentration of absolute power in one man created a system that was simultaneously rigid and incredibly fragile. The stories of those who dared to oppose this machine from within Germany and across Europe reveal the cracks in the facade of total control. These acts of defiance, often overlooked in the broad sweep of military history, tell a different story about the war, one of courage, desperation, and the enduring refusal of the human spirit to be completely crushed. Fact 8. The popular narrative of Nazi Germany often suggests a population unified behind Hitler. But the reality was far more complex. Beyond the famous July 20th, 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler, there were scores of documented attempts on his life. These ranged from the sophisticated, like Georg Elser's bomb in the Munich beer hall in 1939, which missed Hitler by mere minutes when he cut his speech short, to the desperate acts of individuals like Maurice Bavaud, a Swiss theology student who tried to shoot him during a parade. Each attempt reveals the profound fragility of his rule and the constant hidden danger he faced from those who saw his true nature long before the world did. Resistance also festered within the Nazi ranks themselves, a fact often obscured by the image of monolithic loyalty. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of German military intelligence, ran a shadow network that deliberately sabotaged operations and leaked information to the Allies. His was a calculated, treasonous effort to undermine the regime from within its most secretive institution. Similarly, the Red Orchestra spy network included individuals like Haro Schulze-Boysen, an officer in the Reich Ministry of Aviation, who used his position to pass vital intelligence to Moscow. This internal opposition demonstrates that even within the heart of the state, ideological conformity was never absolute. Across occupied Europe, civilian opposition took countless forms, many of which have been lost to history. In Poland, the Home Army orchestrated a massive intelligence-gathering operation that provided the Allies with critical details on German troop movements and V-2 rocket sites. In France, resistance was not just the stuff of romantic legend. It involved the painstaking, dangerous work of forgers creating false documents, railway workers sabotaging supply lines, and ordinary citizens hiding Jewish families at immense personal risk. These movements were fragmented, poorly armed, and constantly hunted by the Gestapo, yet they persisted, proving that occupation did not equal submission. Allied intelligence agencies also ran specific operations targeting Hitler personally. The British SOE and the American OSS actively supported dissident groups within Germany and plotted ways to eliminate the Führer. Allied services developed plans, from bombing to sniper ambush, Operation Foxley, and even floated poisoning concepts, none of which were carried out. These operations were high risk and mostly unsuccessful, but they indicate that the Allied leadership understood that removing the central figure could collapse the entire regime. The focus on Hitler as an individual target highlights a key strategic understanding. The Nazi state was not an impersonal system, but a personality cult built around one man. His survival was synonymous with the regime's survival, and his death would likely trigger its implosion. This constant, multifaceted resistance from both without and within reveals the essential fragility of absolute power. For all the propaganda of strength and unity, the Nazi state was a paranoid entity, constantly looking over its shoulder. The Gestapo's vast network of informants was a testament not to popular support, but to the regime's deep-seated fear of its own people. The fact that Hitler survived so many attempts was less a sign of his security, and more a combination of luck, drastic security measures, and the inherent difficulty of such an operation. The story of the opposition is a crucial correction to the myth of total control, showing that even in the darkest times, courage and conscience never completely vanished. This leads us to confront another layer of myth, the common misconceptions that have grown around Hitler himself, separating the man from the legend. Fact 9. The figure of Adolf Hitler has been so heavily mythologized by both his supporters and his detractors that it can be difficult to separate fact from fiction. One of the most persistent myths concerns his personal life, particularly the idea that he had only one testicle. This story, often repeated as a symbol of his inadequacy, appears to have no basis in any medical records from his numerous physical examinations during the war. It likely originated as British propaganda and has been perpetuated as a simplistic explanation for his psychological makeup. The reality is more complex. His pathologies were rooted in ideology and experience, not anatomy. Another common misconception involves his key decisions, which are often portrayed as the irrational acts of a madman. While his actions were monstrous, they were frequently calculated. The invasion of the Soviet Union, for example, was not a spontaneous, suicidal gamble. It was the culmination of a long-held ideological goal detailed in Mein Kampf and was based on a strategic, though catastrophically flawed, assessment of Soviet weakness. Similarly, the Holocaust was not a single, sudden order, but a gradual, bureaucratic process that evolved from persecution to segregation, and finally, to systematic extermination. Understanding this cold, administrative nature is in many ways more terrifying than believing it was the work of a lone, raving lunatic. Separating Nazi propaganda from the historical record is essential. The regime excelled at creating its own reality. The image of Hitler as a humble, austere leader who shunned luxury was a complete fabrication. While he cultivated a public image of simplicity, his private residences, like the Berghof, were lavishly appointed, and he enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle far removed from that of the average German. The myth of the economically miraculous recovery under the Nazis also requires scrutiny. While unemployment did fall dramatically, this was achieved primarily through massive debt-financed rearmament and by removing women and Jews from the workforce statistics. The economic foundation was unsustainable and designed for war, not long-term prosperity. Exaggerated claims from both sides also cloud the picture. Critics sometimes attribute almost supernatural cunning to Hitler, suggesting he masterminded every detail of the war and the Holocaust. This overstates his direct involvement in daily operations. He was a broad strategist who often delegated implementation to subordinates like Himmler, Goering, and Speer. Conversely, apologists sometimes downplay his role, suggesting he was unaware of the worst atrocities or was a puppet of more radical elements. The historical record is clear. Hitler was the central driving force, the architect of the ideology, and fully complicit in its most horrific consequences. The challenge is to see him as a human being, a deeply flawed, evil, but nonetheless human actor, whose actions stemmed from a combination of fanatical belief, personal ambition, and political opportunity, not from supernatural evil or simplistic psychological defects. Understanding the man behind these myths is critical because it prevents us from dismissing him as an incomprehensible anomaly. When we reduce him to a caricature, we fail to learn the real lessons about how such a figure can rise to power, how a society can be manipulated, and how ordinary bureaucratic processes can be perverted to commit genocide. The banality of evil is perhaps the most difficult concept to grasp, but it is the most important. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that such atrocities are not committed by monsters from another world, but by human beings operating within a corrupted system. This clearer understanding of the man and his actions brings us to his final days, where the myths finally collapsed under the weight of reality. Fact 10. By April 1945, the reality of the situation was inescapable. The Führer bunker, buried deep beneath the Chancellery Garden in Berlin, was a tomb long before it became one. The final military decisions made, there were a mixture of delusion and desperation. Hitler continued to command armies that existed only on paper, moving phantom divisions on maps to block Soviet advances. He placed his last hope in a relief attack by General Walter Wenck's 12th Army, an operation that was logistically impossible from the start. This refusal to accept the collapse of the Eastern Front was the ultimate extension of his lifelong pattern of ignoring inconvenient realities. His orders became increasingly detached, demanding that units fight to the last man in cities that were already overrun, a strategy that caused immense suffering for no strategic gain. His physical and mental decline in those final weeks was stark. The man who had once commanded rallies of millions was now a shuffling, trembling figure. The drug regimens prescribed by Dr. Morell had taken a severe toll, and Hitler's Parkinson-like tremors were becoming impossible to conceal. He aged dramatically, his face gaunt, and his posture stooped. Mentally, he vacillated between bouts of furious, screaming rage and deep, sullen depression. He would erupt at his generals for perceived betrayals, then sink into long, brooding silences. The unwavering confidence that had characterized his public persona had completely shattered, replaced by a paranoid certainty that everyone, including his closest allies like Goering and Himmler, was either incompetent or actively plotting against him. The final interactions with his inner circle were a study in a collapsing court. The atmosphere was thick with fear, betrayal, and a bizarre sense of routine amidst the chaos. His marriage to Eva Braun in the early hours of April 29th was a macabre formality, an attempt to impose a shred of normality on the apocalyptic scene. His political testament, dictated that same night, was a final act of self-justification. blaming the war on international Jewry and exonerating himself and the German people from any responsibility. He then methodically arranged for the disposal of his body, instructing his aides to douse it in gasoline and burn it thoroughly, a clear desire to avoid the fate of Mussolini, whose corpse had been mutilated by partisans. This was his last act of control, an effort to dictate the final chapter of his own story. The immediate aftermath was a frantic scramble by those who remained. Following his suicide on April 30th, the orders were carried out. His body and Eva Braun's were carried up to the garden, placed in a shell crater, and set ablaze. The burning was incomplete, a result of the limited gasoline available amid the Soviet bombardment. When Red Army soldiers discovered the charred remains days later, the identification process began, a grim epilogue to the conflict. The Soviet Secret Service, the NKVD, went to great lengths to confirm his death, conducting dental analysis and interrogating captured bunker personnel. For years, the Soviets would foster speculation that Hitler might have survived, a useful tool for political manipulation during the early Cold War. The truth was that the man who had sought to create a 1,000-year Reich had lasted just 12, and his physical legacy was reduced to ashes in a Berlin garden, a deliberately anonymous end to a life built on a cult of personality. The transition from this individual death to his historical legacy is where the myth-making truly began, as the world struggled to comprehend what had just happened and what it meant for the future. Fact 11. The historical reckoning with Hitler began the moment his death was confirmed, and it has evolved dramatically in the decades since. In the immediate post-war period, the Allied powers, particularly through the Nuremberg trials, constructed a specific narrative. Hitler and his inner circle were unique criminals, and the German people had been largely seduced or coerced by a small gang of fanatics. This bad apple theory was politically convenient for rebuilding Germany as a Cold War ally, but it prevented a deeper examination of the societal complicity that had enabled the regime. For years, a public silence, a collective unwillingness to confront the past, settled over both Germanys. The focus was on reconstruction, not reflection. This began to change in the 1960s. A new generation of Germans, who had not experienced the war directly, started asking difficult questions of their parents. Historians like Fritz Fischer challenged the comforting narrative, arguing that the roots of Nazi aggression extended back into the German Empire. The focus shifted from Hitler as a singular demon to the wider structures of German society, the industrialists, the bureaucrats, the judges, the ordinary citizens, who had, through action or inaction, allowed the atrocities to happen. This was a more unsettling, but more honest reckoning. It moved beyond the figure of Hitler to examine the banality of evil, the way horrific acts can be normalized within a modern administrative state. The ongoing impact on modern politics and society is profound and multifaceted. The Holocaust established a new benchmark for human cruelty, leading directly to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention. The phrase "never again" became a foundational principle of international law and human rights activism. For Germany, the memory of the Nazi era became a central pillar of its new national identity, one defined by pacifism, a deep commitment to democracy, and a heightened sensitivity to any form of extremist politics. This Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or coming to terms with the past, remains a continuous process, a permanent warning etched into the national consciousness. The lessons about leadership, power, and human nature are equally enduring. Hitler's rise demonstrates how economic crisis, national humiliation, and political instability can create fertile ground for demagogues. It shows the danger of substituting charismatic authority for institutional checks and balances. His rule is a case study in how propaganda can distort reality and how fear can be used to dismantle democratic norms. But perhaps the most crucial lesson is about human nature itself. The capacity for ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil when sanctioned by authority and ideology. This is not a comfortable lesson, but it is a necessary one. How history remembers Hitler is, therefore, a constant negotiation. The popular image is often the simplistic caricature, the screaming, evil dictator. But the historical record is more complex, revealing a man who was a product of his time, a skilled political operator, a catastrophic military leader, and the central figure in an unprecedented human tragedy. The pattern of contradictions we've traced, the Peace Prize nominee, the calculated strategist, the frail individual, is the key to understanding. It prevents us from turning him into a mythic monster, which lets us off the hook. Instead, it forces us to see him as a human being who made choices. And in doing so, it forces us to confront the uncomfortable fact that the conditions that created him are not unique to one time or place. The legacy of Adolf Hitler is not just a chapter in a history book. It is a permanent cautionary tale about the fragility of civilization and the dark potential that resides within human societies. Fact 12. The most important fact is the pattern itself. From the Peace Prize nomination to the hidden health issues and the strategic alliances with ideological enemies, Hitler's story is defined by contradiction. This complexity is the real warning. Reducing such a figure to a simple monster makes him seem like a historical anomaly, a one-time event that could never happen again. But understanding the nuances, the calculated image-making, the personal frailties, the bureaucratic machinery of genocide, reveals a more terrifying truth. These were human actions within a human system. The danger lies not in incomprehensible evil, but in the recognizable steps that lead there. Economic despair, national grievance, the erosion of institutions, and the seduction of a strong leader who promises simple solutions. The value of this deeper inquiry is a more vigilant understanding of power. It forces us to look beyond the caricatures and recognize the patterns that can emerge in any society under stress. If you found this journey into the complexities of history valuable, subscribe for more deep dives that challenge the textbook narratives. Let me know in the comments which contradiction you found most revealing.